Tonight, you're not simply falling asleep. You're stepping into the first gallery of a great exhibition of the human soul. Close your eyes and allow yourself to drift into a sleep, where lines, shapes, and symbols speak in the language of humanity's oldest memory. Chapter 5. Conquerors of the World. Romans, Buddhists, Jews, and Christians. 1st–4th centuries, we have seen that in the Roman city of Pompeii, many traces of Hellenistic art have been preserved. Art had not changed much during the time when the Romans, in the course of conquering the world, built their own empire upon the ruins of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Most of the artists working in Rome were Greek, and Roman collectors acquired chiefly the works of great Greek masters or their copies. And yet, when Rome became a world power, certain changes occurred. Artists were faced with new tasks, and their methods adapted accordingly. The Romans achieved their most outstanding successes in the construction of civic engineering works. Everyone knows of the Roman roads, aqueducts, and public baths. Even the ruins of these structures leave a remarkably strong impression. To stroll among their massive supports in Rome is to feel like a small insect. It is these ruins that have preserved for centuries the memory of the grandeur of Rome. Perhaps the most famous of these Roman structures is the vast arena known as the Colosseum. This distinctive monument of Roman architecture has inspired admiration throughout later ages. In essence, it is a utilitarian arched construction, its 3 successive tiers supporting the seating of the vast amphitheater within. But on the outer face of this structure, the Roman architect applied a kind of screen made up of Greek architectural forms. In fact, he employed here all 3 orders found in Greek temples. On the lowest level, a version of the Doric order, complete with metopes and triglyphs. On the 2nd level, engaged Ionic columns, and on the 3rd and 4th levels, Corinthian. This combination of Roman structural design with Greek forms, or orders, had an enormous influence on later architects. Looking around us today, it is not hard to find examples of this influence in the modern city. Probably no single type of architectural structure has left a greater mark on history than the triumphal arch. The Romans built them throughout the empire, in Italy, in France, in North Africa, and in Asia. Greek architecture was typically composed of elements of equal rank, and the same could be said of the Colosseum. In triumphal arches, however, the ordered elements frame and emphasize a wide central opening, flanked and enclosed by narrower side passages. This arrangement of elements in an architectural composition is comparable to a chord in music. The most important features of Roman architecture arise from the use of the arch. This invention was hardly, if at all, employed by the Greeks, though it was apparently known to their architects. To construct an arch of wedge-shaped stones is no simple engineering task. But once the solution was mastered, builders began to apply it in increasingly daring projects. They could now span bridges and aqueducts with arches, and even employ them in vaulted ceilings. By mastering various technical methods, the Romans became highly skilled in the art of vault construction. The most remarkable of such structures is the Pantheon, the temple of all gods. It is the only ancient temple where worship has never been interrupted. In the early Christian period, it was converted into a church, and thus was spared from destruction. The interior of the Pantheon is a vast circular hall covered by a dome with a round opening at its apex, through which the open sky can be seen. There are no other windows, yet the space is filled with abundant, even light descending from above. Few buildings create such a sense of lucid harmony. The heaviness seems to vanish, and the great dome appears to float freely above you, like a reflection of the dome of the heavens. As a rule, the Romans borrowed individual elements from Greek architecture and adapted them to their own needs. The same happened in other fields of artistic creativity. One of the most important demands Roman culture placed upon artists was the creation of a good portrait, art that closely reproduced the sitter's appearance. Such portraits played a significant role in the early religion of the Romans. There was a custom of carrying wax effigies of one's ancestors in funeral processions, a practice undoubtedly rooted in the belief, familiar from Egypt, in the magical power of likeness to protect the soul. Later, during the imperial period, the bust of the emperor was still regarded with sacred awe. Every Roman was required to burn incense before the ruler's bust as a sign of loyalty and allegiance. The refusal of Christians to comply with this obligation is well known to have been one of the causes of their persecution. Strangely enough, the sacred function of these portraits did not prevent them from being strikingly candid, sometimes even ruthlessly truthful, in a way that far surpassed Greek portraiture. This may well have been encouraged by the practice of taking death masks, which gave Roman artists an extraordinary knowledge of the structure of the head and the features of the face. Thus we can recognize Pompey, Augustus, Titus, and Nero, as if we had seen them in a newsreel. There is no trace of flattery in the bust of Vespasian, no attempt to endow him with divine qualities. Such a face could easily belong to a wealthy banker or the owner of a merchant fleet. Yet Roman portraits lacked nothing essential. Somehow the artists managed to remain true to nature without lapsing into banality. Another public commission led to the revival of one of the traditional forms of ancient Near Eastern art. Page 72, Ill 45. The Romans likewise sought to celebrate their victories and record the history of their military campaigns. Thus, Trajan erected a colossal column, which preserves in sculpted narrative the course of his victorious campaigns in Dacia, modern-day Romania. We see Roman legionaries fighting, foraging for provisions, and defeating the enemy. All the achievements of Greek art were brought to bear in this chronicle of the conquerors' deeds. Yet the very aim, to inspire civilian viewers with a detailed account of military exploits, inevitably affected the artistic quality. There is no longer any concern for harmony, beauty, or dramatic expressiveness. The pragmatic Romans were not drawn to the play of imagination. Nevertheless, the narrative techniques they developed for depicting heroic deeds were adopted even in distant lands with very different religious beliefs. In the first centuries of the new era, Hellenistic and Roman art greatly encroached upon and even undermined the traditional foundations of Eastern cultures. Egyptians continued to mummify their dead, but the place of traditional statues was now taken by painted portraits. These were executed by artists trained in the refinements of Greek technique. Even though they were likely produced by humble craftsmen for modest fees, these portraits strike us with the vigor of their realism. Few surviving works of ancient painting look so fresh and modern. It was not only Egyptians who adapted foreign artistic methods to the needs of their faith. In distant India, Roman heroic chronicles influenced artists depicting the peaceful conquest of the world, the story of the Buddha. Sculpture had flourished in India long before Hellenistic influences reached it. The first representations of the Buddha appeared in the border region of Gandhara, and these reliefs became models for later Buddhist art. Illustration shows an episode from the legend of the Great Renunciation of the Buddha. The young prince Gautama leaves his parents' palace to become a hermit. He addresses his beloved horse, "My dear Kanthaka, kindly carry me for the last time tonight. You will help me become the Buddha, and I shall bring salvation to the world of gods and men." The neighing and hoofbeats of Kanthaka might have awakened the city, revealing the prince's departure. Therefore the gods muffled the sound of his voice, and as he galloped away, placed their hands beneath his hooves. The classical ideals of the beauty of gods and heroes were also adopted by the Indians and reflected in the features they bestowed upon their own savior. The serene head of the Buddha, conveying a profound sense of inner peace, was created in the border region of Gandhara. Another Eastern religion, Judaism, also began to adapt sacred history into visual form for the instruction of the faithful. Jewish law prohibited figurative representation out of fear of idolatry. Nevertheless, in Jewish communities in Eastern cities, synagogues' walls began to be decorated with scenes from the Old Testament. One such cycle of paintings was discovered at Dura-Europos, a small military settlement in Mesopotamia. This cycle is not considered a masterpiece, but it is of interest for understanding the artistic processes of the 3rd century. The figures are stiff, the treatment of the scene flat and simplified. The depiction shows Moses striking water from the rock, not so much an illustration of the biblical episode as a pictorial explanation of its meaning. Moses appears disproportionately large, and behind him, inside the tabernacle of the covenant, the menorah can be seen. To indicate that each of the tribes of Israel received its share from the miraculous source, the artist painted 12 streams flowing toward small figures with tents in the background. The painter's skill was modest, which explains the simplicity of his technique. Yet, it is likely he did not aim for naturalism. The more lifelike the figures, the greater the risk of violating the prohibition on image-making. His chief purpose was to remind fellow believers of events in which God had demonstrated his power. The modest synagogue painting is especially significant because similar tendencies emerged with the spread of Christianity from the East. When Christian artists were first called upon to depict the Savior and his apostles, they also drew on the accumulated experience of Greek tradition. One of the earliest surviving representations of Christ, dating to the 4th century, shows not the bearded face familiar from later art, but a youthful figure of ideal beauty. Seated between Peter and Paul, with a dignified posture, he resembles a Greek philosopher. A telling detail links this early Christian relief to pagan Hellenistic art. To indicate Christ's heavenly throne, the sculptor placed beneath his feet the arc of the sky, supported by a celestial deity. The origins of Christian art go back earlier than this relief, but in the very first monuments, Jesus was never depicted. The Jews of Dura-Europos had decorated their synagogue with scenes from the Old Testament to make sacred history visible. In much the same way, the artists who painted the underground Christian cemeteries, the Roman catacombs, sought to convey biblical episodes in pictorial form. A composition known as the Three Youths in the Fiery Furnace, dating to around the 3rd century, demonstrates their familiarity with Hellenistic painting. Like the painters of Pompeii, these artists could define a figure with a few broad brushstrokes. However, they were not overly concerned with the refinements of technique. For them, painting had lost its value as an independent, beautifully crafted object. Its main purpose was to evoke in the faithful the memory of God's mercy and power. The biblical story tells how King Nebuchadnezzar erected a golden idol in the plain of Dura in Babylon, commanding all to bow down before it. 3 Jews refused, and like Christians of the time, faced punishment. They were thrown into the blazing furnace, wearing their turbans and other garments. Yet the fire did not harm them. Not a hair of their heads was singed, and their clothes were unchanged. God sent his angel and delivered his servants. One can imagine how the sculptors of the Laocoon might have treated such a theme had art taken a different path. The catacomb painters, however, sought no dramatic effects. If the aim was to console the faithful and strengthen belief in salvation through an example of divine reward for steadfastness, then it was enough to show 3 human figures in Persian dress, the flames, and the furnace, a symbol of God's protection. Everything unrelated to the essence of the story could be left out. Once again, clarity and simplicity took precedence over strict fidelity to nature. There is something moving in this desire to express the theme in the simplest and most universally understood visual language. The 3 male figures, standing in a row before the viewer with hands raised in prayer, herald the beginning of a new era, when humanity discovered values other than earthly beauty. In the late and declining years of the Roman Empire, this shift in focus appeared not only in religious art. Few artists still upheld the harmony and refined beauty that had been the glory of Greek art. The meticulous, delicate chiseling of marble, so brilliant among Greek masters, no longer attracted sculptors. Like the painters of the catacombs, they were content with rough outlines and often resorted to the mechanical drill. It is often said that these years marked the decline of classical art. And indeed, many skills were lost in the turbulent times of war, revolt, and invasion. But the loss of virtuosity was only one side of the matter. Once artists ceased to be satisfied with technical brilliance for its own sake, they turned to the search for a different visual language. Perhaps this new direction is most clearly seen in portraiture, especially in works of the 4th and 5th centuries. To a Greek of the Praxitelean age, these portraits would have seemed crude and barbaric. A Roman accustomed to the precision of true likeness would have dismissed them as poor craftsmanship. Yet to modern eyes, these figures possess an inner vitality, expressed in the energetic modeling of the features, with eyes emphasized by deep arcs of the eyelids and pronounced brows.